What I'm about to read is from a sermon called Buck O'Neil, Loving You, based upon the 15th chapter of John, verses 12 through 17. More important than any of Buck O'Neil's baseball and civic accomplishments was the simple, profound fact that Buck lived a life of love. For all of the adult stretch of his 94 years, Buck lived a life of love. Beginning in Florida and all through the baseball barnstorming days on the road and throughout his tenure with the Monarchs and then the Cubs and then the Royals and then with the Negro League Baseball Museum, Buck lived a life of love. He embodied exquisitely and eloquently the love ethic as we have heard it in the Gospel of John in the 15th chapter. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Buck lived out this ethic in his own unique way. He lived it out first and foremost by dismissing the option of bitterness. He consistently dismissed the option to be bitter about anything or anyone. In the degradation of segregation in Florida, he didn't get bitter, he got better as a baseball player. And he got out of his celery field overalls and into a baseball uniform. When he didn't get to play in the show, having only ever played in the Negro Leagues, he didn't express bitterness. Instead, he worked to get others into the game and then later Negro League stars into the Hall of Fame. And when he missed being voted into the Hall of Fame by one meager vote, he was surely crestfallen inwardly, but he didn't show it outwardly. "Old Buck's going to be all right," he said. "Buck's already in the Hall of Fame. I'm in the Friendship Hall of Fame," he said. The second way he lived out a life of love was by delighting in the daily. Every day was a beautiful day to Buck, and every person was beautiful to him. He would never regard anyone he met as beneath him or lower than himself. He would do as Jesus did, simply calling them his friends. His attention to the daily and his devotion to the loveliness in the ordinary was most clearly evident in his loving relationship with his wife, Ora Lee. And he loved her with fierce loyalty and a special grace when she was discovered to have cancer. As the Kansas City Star reported, Buck would call her years of fighting the disease the greatest 15 years of my life. Above and beyond dismissing the option of bitterness and delighting in the daily, Buck lived a life of love by daring to love others first. We were privileged to host Buck at Community Christian Church on numerous occasions, at a steak cookout sponsored by the Men's Fellowship, during a Colors Juneteenth celebration, in a Martin Luther King interfaith service, and he always came dressed impeccably and ready to go with a huge smile on his face. He always seemed interested in your welfare and what you were doing. He was genuinely interested in what was going on with you, what was going on in the world, and how he and you and how we could make it better. This was even true at the end of Buck's life, when his strength was ebbing away, when he had lost much of his zip and most of his pizzazz. Even then, though, he expressed his love for others. In Buck O'Neil, we have beheld not a perfect person, but one who sought to live, as best he could, a life of love that dismissed the option of bitterness, that delighted in the daily, and that dared to love others first before anything else. It was natural then, and perfectly in tune with the gist and grit of the gospel, that Buck's famous theme song was "The Greatest Thing." The greatest thing in all the world is loving you. The greatest thing in all the world is loving you. The greatest thing in all the world is loving you. The greatest thing in all the world is loving you. May we learn to sing it in our own day, in our own way, in our own key. And when we do not be surprised if there arises from the celestial realm beyond a heavenly and harmonious echo and a great and glorious laugh from Buck O'Neill. Amen. This is from a sermon called Shepherds Waking Up to a Precious Gift. In the days of Jesus' birth, shepherds had a hard life and a bad rap among folks. They almost always lived outdoors with only a camel hair cloak and a head veil to guard them against the weather. They ate only what they could carry: bread, cheese, olive, figs, maybe dates, raisins. Their sole focus was the sheep, protecting them by day, rescuing them when they got lost or stuck in a dried out gully, binding up their wounds, watching out for them at the sheep gate, keeping the sheep safe from the predators. They not only had a hard life, but a disreputable one as well. They were considered nomadic lowlifes, or worse, and they were often regarded with suspicion, distrust, and dislike. And besides, they weren't very religious. Shoot, they wouldn't have known a protocol in the cleanliness code to save their lives. They had no in-depth knowledge of the intricacies of ceremonial life, and they had slim ideas about the rules, regulations, and meticulous observances required of good Hebrew folks to call themselves righteous and good. In short, they were rather lacking in religious flair. Shepherds even today are similarly cut down to a debased level, even in the collected wisdom of theological textbooks. If you tried to discover what the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible has to say about shepherds, lo and behold, in all 3,954 pages of that text, you find no definitions or descriptions, only a scant reference: see sheep. Yet still, God comes to us through the lowly shepherds. Because the shepherds were humble enough, they were able to wake up to surprising gifts in their lives, and they were never the same again. What were those surprising gifts? I'm glad you asked that question. You have to think that they went back to shepherding with a different spring in their step. Maybe they even pondered what the child in the stable would become. Maybe some of them, if they were young enough, heard about how he grew up and took off his carpenter's apron, and then one day took up preaching, even referring to himself as the Good Shepherd. You also have to think that regardless of their intellectual clarity or denseness, they went back to their shepherding with a greater inclination to gaze upward at the heavens, looking for another visitation of the heavenly hosts, perhaps. Or maybe they were simply looking up at the vast canopy of the sky and seeing what scientists calculate as the 62 quintillion, 500 quadrillion stars that have been spewed across the universe. That's enough stars, for each of Earth's inhabitants today to lay claim to 10,416,000 stars each. What were the surprising gifts to which the dumbfounded shepherds awoke? God's presence, to be sure, in the form of a little baby who would bless humanity from the bottom up, starting with the shepherds. That they didn't really have to fear for their lives because their lives were held in the palm of the hand of the one who made all life, who was and is and will be the real security system, the real spiritual security system, which nothing can ever disrupt, interrupt, or bankrupt. That all those miraculous stars above their heads, too numerous even to count, except for a physicist measuring calculus, all those stars can lead us to wondering instead of wandering, to love instead of lifelessness, to the freedom of merciful joy instead of an acrid bitterness because of a lack of justice, to a fullness of the soul instead of overeating our way to satisfaction, to the grace of each new day instead of the futility of waiting for Godot, to future projects and dreams and journeys that make our hearts sing like the first day of creation instead of languishing in regret over what might have been. May it be so for all of those who are shepherding their lives and the lives of others along the human journey, whether or not they know anything about sheep. Amen. This sermon was based on Micah 6:8, and that text goes, He has shown you, O humanity, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Before we depart, I need to say something about strategic, visionary hopefulness. Allow me to share a story with you. In 1926, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson became the first African-American president of Howard University. Mordecai Johnson would go on to lure Dr. Howard Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, to join the faculty, and then nearly a decade later, to encourage them to go on a pilgrimage of friendship to India, where they would be among the first 4 African Americans to meet and have deep discussions with Mohandas K. Gandhi. Thurman would then bear the tenets of nonviolence to the United States, where he would convey the great Mahatma's strategy to generations of adherents who would lead the civil rights struggle toward its fulfillment. When he began, however, Mordecai Johnson had another primary concern: raising the standards of the law school, which was then little more than a night school. Supreme Court Justice, Associate Justice Louis Brandeis, counseled Johnson, emphasizing that the foundation for overcoming racial discrimination was embedded in the Constitution. What was needed, Brandeis averred, was for lawyers to be prepared to base their arguments before the court precisely upon the guarantees in the document. Agreeing with Brandeis's thesis and taking his counsel to heart, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson secured Charles Hamilton Houston as Vice Dean of the Howard University Law School in 1929, and things then got moving. An initial class of 30 students was eventually enrolled in Howard University's now fully accredited, full-time program with an intensified civil rights curriculum. Johnson and Houston were bound and determined to train top-notch, world-class lawyers who would lead the fight against racial injustice. Among the first 8 students who graduated in 1930 was a young man named Thurgood Marshall. The rest, as they say, is history. Marshall would go on to lead the successful Brown versus the Board of Education case that abolished legal segregation in public education in the United States. Eventually, he became the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. Mordecai Johnson and Charles Hamilton Houston were not the only ones to lead America toward the dismantling of institutional prejudice in the 20th century, but their strategic, visionary hopefulness contributed mightily to the transformation of American culture and the promise of American democracy for one and all. Strategic, visionary hopefulness. This is what is required to make for greater racial justice for one and all.